Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It's a beautiful September day, and boy, things are really coming alive out here in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Let's jump in. Let's see what we see. And moving just up the trail here, we've got a really cool mushroom that I love to see. This is a very common sight out here. This is a saprophyte, a saprophytic mushroom. It grows off of both hardwoods and conifers. This is what's commonly referred to as Trembling Phlebia, Phlebia tremellosa. Take a look at this. Isn't that beautiful? So this one will get those little formations. Kind of almost can look a little bit like a crystalline structure of sorts on those edges. Look at that. Isn't that something? Just a real beautiful mushroom that I see frequently, but I almost always stop to investigate just because it has that tendency to be such a stunner in terms of its visual display. Isn't that beautiful? And you can see how it'll form kind of like these radiating little patches, but also it'll form these almost like cavernous little systems here. Look at that, isn't that something? And you can see how the cap will get this real distinctive, almost looks like sort of like a bacon fat or something up on the top of that. Isn't that something? Just beautiful. Almost looks alien or otherworldly in some of these different forms. And this can be somewhat variable depending on, the substrate and just kind of where it's fruiting. But just a real beautiful mushroom. Keep your eye peeled for this one. It occurs in many different forms. It's always one of those ones that just is fun to admire. And just behind this Trembling Phlebia log, in and amongst the western red cedars and the sword ferns, I see a really cool mushroom hiding back there in and amongst the ferns. Let's go take a closer look at that. Let's check it out. So some of you may recognize this guy right away. This is what's oftentimes referred to as an Earthstar. This particular one goes by the common name, the sessile Earthstar. This is Geastrum cicadum. And look at this. Isn't that a thing of beauty? Just look at that. So you'll notice this one in particular has 6 rays. This particular species will oftentimes have 5 to 8 rays. And this is essentially a puffball that's housed in here. So this is really soft to the touch. You see that it's got this little pore or hole. Notice that it's got this little ring or ridge right around that central pore. That's a real distinctive feature of this particular one. You'll also notice that this little puffball structure that's seated on those rays is seated directly on it. So there's no kind of stipe or little stem. Some of the other earth stars that are out here will have a little bit of elevation off of those rays by way of a stipe. So this is just a fascinating mushroom, and it's one that I don't see all that often here in the Pacific Northwest. So we've got about a dozen species out here in the Pacific Northwest, but it's not all that common. This is the time of year where I start to see them poking their heads out. These are a lot more common in arid regions. So if you were to go east of the crest of the Cascades, you may find more of these. You'll also find more of them in the Southwest or just kind of desert, arid regions. These will actually start out as kind of a closed bulb. So these little sepals or petals here will be totally bound around that puffball at the center. And given the opportunity and the right conditions, it'll actually unfurl or unfold in the way that we're seeing right here. So even though this particular species is not regarded as being edible, it does have a really long history of use from a medicinal standpoint, and that goes for Earthstars in general. But even this specific species, this is known to have antioxidant as well as anti-inflammatory properties. So in terms of traditional use, this has been used to treat eye infections and asthma. And then in a broader sense, Earthstars have been used in traditional Chinese medicine for quite some time. And you know, even looking back at the history of the Americas, the Mayans are noted for using this to staunch wounds and, you know, different preparations of this. It's known to possess a wide range of bioactive compounds. So very interesting. My suspicion is that there's still quite a bit to learn about this one. So just a real beauty out here, adding quite a bit of flair here to the forest floor, and really has picked a nice place to call home. So let's go ahead and try something real quick. I'm going to get in here real close, and I'm just going to give this a little squeeze. Let's see what happens here. Do you see that? Really incredible, right? So I just turned around to come back because I realized I never flipped this over to take a look at the underside. Let's take a look. Oh wow, so look at this. See those longitudinal cracks on the underside of this? On each of those rays? This is super interesting, and this is actually going to cause me to retract my initial assessment of which Earthstar I thought this was. So I'm now going to have to go with what's commonly referred to as the Flask Earthstar, Geastrum lageniforme. And this is not an Earthstar that I've ever positively ID'd or encountered in the field, at least not in a form that I was able to assess properly. But with this being so fresh, you know, there are a lot of species of Earthstars that look really similar, and I think that that's what we're looking at. So not cicadum, but lageniforme. So let me know if you've got an opinion on this. I'd be super curious to get your thoughts. And wow, look at this beautiful little cluster of mushrooms down here. This is one of our Inkycaps. So this one, commonly referred to as the rabbit's foot Inkycap, Coprinopsis lagopus group. So sometimes you'll hear hare's foot Inkcap. This is similar to some of the other Inkycaps that you may be familiar with already. So you'll notice we've got kind of these matted tufts of hairs on the cap. If we look at the stipe, notice that it's flocose, so it's finely haired. That'll eventually smooth out, but look at these young ones down at the bottom. This is actually exactly how it gets its name. That's somewhat reminiscent of a rabbit's foot. So that's where it gets its name, the rabbit's foot Inkycap. And just as is the case with other Inkycaps, these gills are going to deliquesce, which is just a fancy way of saying that they're going to liquefy. And as we look underneath, we see a little bit of a spore print here, and we also notice that it's a very dark spore color. I'm going to go ahead and give this a little tug. This is a very delicate little mushroom, and it's also going to be incredibly fleeting. So this will oftentimes just last for a number of hours. But you see underneath, just beautiful. We've got these pleated or grooved caps, and that's real distinct with this particular one. And again, that's only going to last a very, very short amount of time. These younger ones down here, within a matter of hours, are going to fruit up into ones that will be more similar to these larger ones that we're seeing. So what a treat to encounter this one. And wow, look at this up here underneath these ferns. We've got a really cool one. Look at that red, vibrant cap. I'm gonna actually pan over here because I see some that are especially photogenic looking. Take a look at these guys. So just beautiful examples of what I believe is likely the shrimp Russula. Beautiful. This is Russula xerampelina, the shrimp Russula. You can see, so first off, this group is collectively known as the brittle gills, and as referenced in previous videos on this channel, the cell structure of these is different than other mushrooms. So it's not an elongated cell structure, but rather a circular structure that enables it to snap or break. And the gills are also going to be brittle. We can see these have gotten some serious slug damage on them, but you can see this slight blushing on the stipe here. These gills, as the name would suggest, are going to be really brittle, so you can see they just kind of peel off. Additionally, the stipe is going to snap just like chalk. So it's not going to do that stringy thing that, say, the chanterelles or other mushrooms do. So it's not giving us a kind of longitudinal or kind of fibery break. They're more kind of a crisp, clean snap. And one thing that's unique about this particular genus is that you can do what's called a nibble and spit test on the edge, and you can get a good sense of its edibility. Now, it looks like plenty of creatures have been doing nibble tests on this, so I might refrain from this particular one, but there's a whole lot of Russulas out here. And so, you know, a lot of them are edible. None of them are going to be deadly toxic, but one thing that's really cool is that just by doing that nibble and spit test, you can get a good sense of whether it's a good edible mushroom or one that you want to toss out and leave on the side of the trail. If it's one that's not edible or that is not desired, it's going to be very acrid, so very like spicy flavor to it, and you'll know it when you taste one of these. Sometimes it takes a little time for that spice or that kick to really take effect, but you'll certainly notice it. The shrimp Russula is one of those ones that that's one of the Russulas that people actually pursue for the dinner table. So it's definitely one that's desirable and considered choice. We'll see what we've got going on here if this one's been less impacted by the wildlife. Yeah, look at that. This one's a lot fresher. Now on this one in particular, I'm not seeing that blushing. Well, I guess I see a little bit, slight blushing on the stipe there, which is to say just that little red color. So I may give this a little nibble and spit test, kind of confirm its identity to the best of my ability and see. But a very complicated genus with a lot of different species, so it can be a little bit of a tricky one. It's also worth noting, so I've been on a kick in terms of pronunciation of the genus. I've been saying Russula, which is kind of, in the past I've said Russula or Russula or even Russula. So you'll hear it all from mycologists of all walks. There doesn't seem to be consensus on the pronunciation of that genus, much as is the case with fungi, and the like. There are several things in the world of mushrooms that we don't always get consensus on. So I'd be curious to hear from you if you've got a favorite way of pronouncing this, or if you think that there's one way that's more right than the others. I'd love to hear from you. I know a lot of the old school mycologists like Paul Stamets, Daniel Winkler, and others will get that Russula, so it almost sounds like they're referring to a Russian mushroom. But I know that that's one of the preferred pronunciations. I just have always felt funny saying it that way, but a lot of people would argue that Russula is also pretty weird, so maybe I should start saying Russula. Let me know what you think down in the comments. But cool to see. So I did carry out a nibble and spit test on that one back there, and it was quite good. It was really mild, so no spice or acridity to it, or acridness. So I think that, boy, this has been chewed on by rodents pretty minimally, but I can see some little chew marks on it. If I can find a real nice flush of these, I might take some of these home and cook with them. But what a beautiful colored cap, right? That wine colored cap. Just a real beauty out here. So I'm gonna keep my eyes peeled for the perfect bunch of shrimps and see what I can do to cook them up. Awesome to see out here. So these can be notoriously difficult to differentiate. So one of the things that we're looking for to determine that this is in fact the shrimp Russula, Russula xerampelina, is to look for, so we're looking for, you know, anything from like reddish to rosy to purplish color on the cap. We can actually get an even wider range than that, but those are the most common shades. Again, we're looking for white gills, obviously one of the brittle gills, so we're looking for this breaking like chalk. We're also looking at a little bit of blushing on the stipe, so you can see where it's a little bit pinkish on the stipe. If I take this and I just kind of scratch it, we're looking for it to start out initially as, you know, a little bit of yellow staining and then slowly to a brownish color. That's one of the hallmarks of this particular Russula. And as mentioned earlier, of course, the nibble and spit test, we're looking for something that's not acrid. So we're looking for it to be a relatively mild tasting fungal flavor as opposed to something that makes you feel like your mouth's on fire. So those are all things that we're kind of paying attention to with this particular one. And you can see that it's starting to stain a little bit. This staining will happen both from handling it and especially if you kind of take your nail and rub it the way that we did. So I know that the color is kind of a little bit variable based on what's coming through, but I can tell that that's browning, which makes me relatively confident that this is in fact the one that we're after. So just wanted to take a quick second to point that out. And again, a notoriously tricky group out here in the forest. We have so many of these, many of which are not adequately described. So it's quite a conundrum trying to get it down to species, but because the shrimp Russula is, you know, a very sought after edible Russula, it's one of those ones that you want to kind of have all the tools in your tool belt to help to determine what that one is. So one other quick thing that I forgot to mention that I should have mentioned, it may be obvious, but we call this one the shrimp Russula because when it's, out in the wild, so pre-cooked, it's going to have kind of a fish-like, or some people describe it as crab-like, or obviously shrimp kind of seafood scent. Now this cooks away once we take it home and throw it in the pan. That fish-like aroma is going to dissipate or disappear, but that's another one of those hallmark features. So there you go. So we're looking for color of the cap, kind of pithy core or center when we break that. So I'm not sure if you can see that, but it broke like chalk, and then it's got a little bit of a softer inner core. It's also, of course, got that kind of seafood, fishy smell to it. It's got this brown staining on the stipe, and if we give it the nibble and spit test, which I did on the edge of another one of these, we're looking for it to be mild as opposed to acrid. So that's the full list as far as I know it. And take a look at this. Boy, these guys are just really coming out. So this one, different colored cap, but you can see it pushing through the duff here. Pretty fresh, and this is going to be very firm to the touch. Give it a little bit of a tug. So notice how, again, we've got those clear white gills. There's no vulva down at the bottom. This is another one of our brittle gills, so one of the Russulas. And so beautiful to see. This is a really nice specimen. We get a real rainbow of colors of these in the fall time. So all kinds of shades. So you saw some of the reddish or pinkish shrimps a second ago, and now you're seeing kind of this orangish brown/yellow color. So really pretty mushrooms. I love seeing these out here. And there's a lot more of these to come in the days ahead. Adding a little color out here to the forest floor. And wow, check this out. So right off the trail here, we have an awesome example of fungi on mushrooms. And this one is kind of a unique instance of that because, you know, anytime we have fungi fruiting on mushrooms or doing its thing, that's kind of unusual, right? One prime example of that is the lobster mushroom, Hypomyces lactiflorum. So as many of you, I'm sure, know, that's an example of Hypomyces lactiflorum, a parasitic mold kind of taking over Russula breviipes. In this instance, this is a little bit different because of the simple fact that we've got classic looking mushroom. You can see this is actually the same mushroom. So the one with the white cap and the one with the brown powdery cap, those are both the same mushroom growing on a blackening Russula. So we've got Russula nigricans, so the blackening Russula. Isn't that interesting? So you can see in its younger stages, it's going to have this white cap, white stipe. These are very, very unique. So out here in the Pacific Northwest, there are two species that are within the same genus. And the genus that hosts these two similar mushrooms is known as Asterophora. Sometimes it's referred by the common name piggybacks. And you can see why, because they're piggybacking or growing off of this Russula. Now it's worth noting that all of these Asterophora mushrooms are going to occur on Russula and Laccaria. So interesting to think that a lot of these kind of fungi on mushroom situations that we see are oftentimes the host is within Russula and Laccaria. So that's kind of an interesting little side note. So the first one in the Asterophora that I referenced in that genus is Asterophora parasitica. This is not that one. Asterophora parasitica would have a smooth cap, so it wouldn't have this powdery structure that we're seeing here. So it would look more like these immature, undeveloped ones. This one is in fact Asterophora lycoperdoides. Now, what's interesting about both of these and what makes it different from a lot of other mushrooms is that, sure, these are capable of creating or producing basidiospores. So just like other mushrooms, right? You can see it's got a clearly defined stipe, as well as it's going to have gills that aren't super distinct underneath, but those are capable of producing spores. But what makes these really different, these Asterophora genus mushrooms, is that they've also got asexual spores that are called chlamydospores. And that's actually what we're seeing here on the cap. So when you look at that and you see that brown powdery mess up on the cap of this, let me actually brush some of those off. So you can see that some of those are on my finger, some of the remains of those, if it'll come into focus. And you can see that little mark where I brushed up against it. So these chlamydospores will be dispersed by wind and rain and different things like that. And a lot of times we don't really see these mushrooms come out because oftentimes the host mushroom, if it's too rainy, it'll oftentimes decompose and disintegrate before these really have ample opportunity to take root and to do their thing. So it's kind of a cool treat to get to see these. Sometimes we do see these in the early kind of fall season when we're getting a mix of a little bit of rain, some warmer temperatures, but not so much rain that things are decomposing too quickly. So really awesome to see this out here. And you know, it's worth noting, so this one, Asterophora lycoperdoides, is also called the powder cap. And you can certainly see where it gets its name, right? And if you see that brown powder on the cap, you know that this is your species. And this can grow on a range of Russulas, but this is the one that I most typically see it on, the blackening Russula, Russula nigricans. So really interesting to see out here. It's really unclear on this. So, you know, I referenced a second ago the lobster mushroom and how Hypomyces lactiflorum is parasitic on Russula breviipes. And so that's a clear case where, you know, it is parasitic because it's parasitizing the Russula it's preventing that Russula from producing gills and spores, so it's no longer capable of doing its thing. In this instance, it's a little bit different because at this stage, these Asterophora mushrooms are coming in, and it's unclear whether they're just part of the natural kind of decomposition or decomposing process, right? So they're breaking down this mushroom and kind of helping it move along in its natural life cycle, or if it's parasitic in nature. So it's a little less defined. It seems to me that it's more just kind of part of that, you know, that stage of this Russula's life where it's decomposing and it's helping to break it down and do what mushrooms do out here as the ultimate natural composting machine. But I'd be curious to get your take on it. So if you've got a sense of that, let me know what you think. But again, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pluck one of these so that we can kind of take a closer look underneath. So you can see this one is mature, so it's got those, again, those chlamydospores that are the asexual spores up top that you're seeing as that brown powder. It's also still got this white stipe. And if we look underneath, I'm going to actually set this down so that we can really focus in there and get a look. So notice that the gills aren't super well defined, right? So we refer to those as just being poorly developed gills. But as I referenced earlier, it's still producing basidiospores from underneath. So it's got kind of a dual mechanism going on. And we can see that these ones that don't have or that lack that brown spore powder up top, those are just the immature ones. So if we come back in a day or two, they're probably going to have that powdery mass up top. So again, awesome to see mushrooms on mushrooms, a somewhat rare sight out here. So beautiful to see. And boy, this one that's in the process of decomposing, I can smell from all the way back here. Those are quite fragrant. Also smelling shrimpy, like the shrimp Russula, but not in as pleasant of a manner as the shrimp Russula. So super interesting to see. Again, that's the powder cap, Asterophora lycoperdoides out here, one of the piggybacks, one of two piggybacks that we see out here that are in that genus, both growing on Russula and Laccaria. So very cool to see. And check this out, just down the trail from that powder cap, so I stopped to admire this little Russula here, and look what caught my eye right back here. We've got yet another just great example of this powder cap doing its thing, and you can see the mass of bugs flying away from this as I go back. So this is well on its way in that decay process, but boy, isn't that just a beautiful example of that guy. You can just see all the features of that, again, coming out from a Blackening Russula right here, up from the duff. Just beautiful. Look at those chlamydospores up top. Really interesting to think about those going off into the environment, possibly too using these insects as part of their kind of strategy for getting those spread out amongst these different rotting and decaying Russulas. So very cool to see. Let's try something really quickly here. So just like we did on the other, let's actually pull this. I'm kind of curious to see if we can get a good look at the gills. Oh yeah, so this is a much better shot underneath. So you can see I'm going to actually set this down so that we can take a look. Boy, talk about poorly developed. It almost looks like a gelatinous slime of sort underneath. Look at that. Just wild. And you can see all those chlamydospores coming off on my hands here. We're probably helping this guy spread throughout the forest just through handling it for a short bit, but really interesting to get a clear picture of what's going on underneath that cap. Just a really fascinating little mushroom to encounter out here. So cool. And check this out. Here's kind of a cool sight just off of the trail here. Look what we got here. A little rodent skull of sorts. Look at those teeth. Isn't that something? You can see those things just keep on growing, doing their thing. Cool to see. So check this out. I had to just stop, pause, and appreciate what all's going on with this guy. So we've got this old Douglas fir. It's all covered with lichens and mosses, doing its thing, deep furrows in the bark. This is an old tree, relatively speaking. And then down at the base of this, notice that we've got our old friend, the Dyer's polypore. And notice that on the Dyer's polypore, so we've got insects just kind of swarming around here. We've got molds growing on that, so we can see that there. And then if we kind of pan down, we see more of that activity on here. And then on top of that, we've got a slug going to work. So we've got so many different layers of decomposition going on all at the same time. And a lot of it is sourced in this Douglas fir. So even though this Doug fir is still very much alive and doing his thing out here in the forest, the decomposition process, or really the death and decay of this tree, has already started. And there are already aspects or elements of this tree's life that are starting to enter that next phase of just kind of recycling and channeling all these different nutrients that have accumulated in this tree over the years, are being kind of in that early stage of recycling and re-entering to a new stage of new growth and development out here. And all these guys playing a role, from our friend the banana slug here, to the Dyer's polypore, to even this unusual mold that has developed on the Dyer's polypore. They're all playing their role here. So some of the great decomposers working together to compose their own little symphony out here in the forest of the Pacific Northwest. Very cool to see. A lot going on, more than we are ever aware of. So very cool to see. And boy, we've got so much going on out here. So I'm seeing a lot of these little colorful guys out here on the side of the trail. I believe that these are likely deceivers in the Laccaria genus. Take a look, real distinctive gill structure, kind of fibrous, shiny stipe there. These guys, I'm seeing quite a few of them. They can be quite variable in their look or in their appearance. There's the Laccaria laccata group, which is just kind of the most commonly cited or referenced deceiver, but there are quite a range of them. Sometimes they can be tough to differentiate, but I'm also seeing another example of these guys. So we talked about this earlier. This is Lycoperdon genus, Lycoperdon perlatum, the common puffball. You can see this one's got this weird kind of oblong shape. This is popping up right on the trail, so several of these have been kicked over. But I'm seeing more that are sort of our classic, what we think of as a puffball shape. And look at this, how at the top of this guy, you can see that there's that little hole at the top. So this is where those spores puff out. Now it's worth noting that these spores, I referenced this in a video past, last year, that you really don't want to breathe these in. So these can create a condition that's known as lycoperdinosis. So they've got a really unique spore that is not good on the lungs. So if you are playing with these, which I'm sure a lot of us have that experience as kids of kind of stomping on these or kind of squishing them or squirting spores out the way that I was just demonstrating there. So if you do it, just pay attention to where the wind's blowing. Try to make a conscious effort to not breathe too many of those in. So those ones back there in that state where they're clearly distributing spores, let's take a closer look at this one up here to see what it looks like on the inside. All right, so here we go. So I'm just going to give this a quick cut. So we talked about how this one is edible when young, but at this stage, it's far past that point. Oh man, notice how we've got a gooey mess of spores in there. And you can see they're certainly not white and spongy. It's kind of like this kind of gross, disgusting brownish green color. So I've got to say, based on this appearance, this is not something that I would be too concerned about someone mistaking for an edible mushroom and eating. Kind of tough to imagine wanting to consume that. But, that's one of those things to really look for on this is, these more mature specimens are not edible. Whereas the really young ones, so if that had a solid white interior like we saw earlier, that would be a good edible mushroom that you could use much in the same way as a common button mushroom. So good to be able to differentiate and distinguish between those, and any color other than white inside, whether that's darker or this kind of brown spore mass inside, it's way past its prime. So best left alone to do its thing and spread its spores out here the way that it's doing right over there. So interesting to see. And look at this, right off the trail, one of my absolute favorite little mushrooms. This is one that's oftentimes overlooked. This is what's known as the Earpick Fungus, Auriscalpium vulgare. And this was, one of those ones that it took me a little while to find this initially, because it's so subtle. Even though it's enduring and it can last for a really long time, it's very often overlooked, and it will always be growing from a cone. So if I dig down to the base of this, I've got, sure enough, a cone that's covered in moss. This is a Doug fir cone that's fruiting with this little earpick fungus. And if you look underneath on this one, not only is the cap super vibrant, cool looking mushroom, but look underneath. So it's got these little teeth-like structures, just like your hedgehog mushrooms. And in fact, when Linnaeus initially discovered this one, he placed it in the Hydnum genus, along with the hedgehogs. But this is in fact much, much different. So it's got obviously that very similar tooth structure for spore production underneath, but it's a much different mushroom. This is one that I forget which book jokes around about this. It might be Aurora, or it might be, I don't know, it might be Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. One of those books, they reference having a little pet, taking this cone home with you and having an Auriscalpium vulgare pet, earpick fungus, which I thought was really interesting to think about, kind of bringing this home to a terrarium or even to the yard and just kind of watching it do its thing and grow. But what a beauty. I'm going to definitely leave it right where it is and rebury the cone and let it continue to do its thing out here. But boy, what a beautiful, beautiful mushroom. And you can see how easy this would be to miss. It's very subtle. And this one will persist and stick around, and the cap will become totally darkened to the color of the stipe. So these are the young ones that have this really pronounced lighter margin. But just incredible color shades on these young specimens, and just a real beauty. Again, one of my favorites to encounter out here. This is the Earpick Fungus. Beautiful to see. And just back here, we've got a beautiful little mushroom that I've been seeing a lot of. This is a relatively common sight out here in the Pacific Northwest come late summer, early fall. This is the Skullcap Daperling, Leucocoprinus brevissonii. Look at this, just a beautiful, delicate little mushroom. You'll notice that, the cap is going to have this little umbo that's finely felted. Also around that margin, notice that it's pleated and striate. So this one, some of you may think that this looks pretty similar to some of the Lepiotas, and historically, these were all grouped together. More recently, those have been getting broken down into different genus assignments, but underneath you'll notice free gills that are close to one another. Sometimes you'll catch a little annulus. This is likely a toxic mushroom, so one that's best admired and left alone out here on the forest floor. Beautiful to see. It's not unusual for me to go into an area where I know other people have been harvesting and just to look really carefully. Chanterelles have a funny way of just finding the ultimate little hiding spots. Check this out. So underneath this log and this fern, look at this guy doing his thing. So this one, in order to forage or harvest that, I might actually have to move this log just a bit. So I'm going to reach under there and get that. But it just goes to show that, even if you feel like, someone's been through this area or has really kind of scoured the surface, don't let that discourage you from going in and just slowing down and taking a good close look. Because I'm sure that for everyone that I see that someone else leaves behind, I'm sure I'm walking past so many of these that I'm not seeing. I bumped into a fellow forager out here in my local forest just recently when I was harvesting some white chanterelles. And he told me what his dad used to say. He told him that, hey, if chanterelles could jump, the sky would be black because so many would be jumping up off the forest floor. Wouldn't even be able to see the sky. I thought that was pretty neat and very accurate to my experience out here in the forest. So cool to think about how many we're not seeing and just enjoying the ones that we get lucky enough or fortunate enough to spot. So don't get discouraged out there. Keep looking, especially in those premier hiding spots. They really have a tendency to be able to find those. So keep looking. They're out there. And check this out. Here's a welcome sight. Just on this mossy little stretch, look what we see out here. So it looks like none other than our old friend, the white chanterelle, Cantharellus subalbidus. So if you caught the episode 2 or 3 weeks back, we really went into depth and detail on these. Boy, this has been a heck of a year for the white chanterelle. It is really out. I'm gonna go ahead, let's give this guy a tug, just confirm things. Let's see how it's looking. Wow, look at that. So a lot of times these guys will be buried. You can see how the cap is kind of starting to turn a little golden. These will stain and can sometimes look somewhat similar to the Pacific golden chanterelle. But underneath, as those are displaying, we see clearly that it's much different. They're going to have those ivory colored white gills. Let's give this one a tug. Boy, another pair. Just beautiful. And of course, just like the other chanterelles, it's got these decurrent gills that are running down the stipe. Here's its buddy over here. A lot of times they'll grow in pairs or, even more. And, as you saw a couple weeks back, it's unlikely that there's just one, and that goes for a lot of the chanterelles, but especially for the white chanterelles. I feel like, boy, if I find one, I'm really looking closely because we're likely to encounter many chanterelles, and a lot of times these don't even break the surface. So they'll be hiding under moss and duff. These ones are a little further along, so they've really flowered out. Boy, look at these. Just beautiful. And these are chunky. So, I know I referenced this before, but these are going to have a firmer texture than the Pacific golden chanterelles. So they're going to hold up a little better, and they can be a little dirtier because of their nature for hiding. Look under here. Here's a little one. We're going to let that guy stay right where he is. No need to unearth him. But boy, they have that interesting characteristic of oftentimes never breaking through the surface. And that can lead to them being a little dirtier, but boy, still one of the tastiest mushrooms that you'll encounter out here. In truth, I would say, depending on when you ask me, I may actually prefer these over the Pacific golden chanterelle. And boy, you can see as I'm looking around, these are just everywhere. No shortage of these guys today, that's for sure. This guy's breaking a little bit, but I'll see what I can do to keep them as intact as possible. But, as referenced, a lot of times the fact that these do like to hide underground, sometimes it can take a little effort finding their hiding spots, and then once you do, it can be a little work getting them out from their hiding place. Beautiful, though. And eventually you get pretty darn good at spotting these little shrumps or little bumps under the moss where these mushrooms are hiding. And there's nothing quite like unearthing a mushroom that's just out of the line of sight or just under the surface. There's something so aesthetically pleasing about brushing that moss aside and peeling back a layer of duff to unearth your prize. So, boy, look at this one, just like the others. Really a thing of beauty. And this one's got some heft. No doubt about that. Beautiful. And this is kind of crazy because as I look around, I'm seeing a lot more obvious ones and then plenty of shrumps. So look up here, you can see another one right there. And as I look over in here, this is just full of them. I can see them everywhere. And as has become the practice out here, so I've got my little cuttings, right? So I've cut the base off of these white chanterelles, and I've moved just a little further through the forest to what looks like suitable habitat for more chanterelles. But I'm specifically choosing a spot where I'm not necessarily seeing any evidence of them being currently. So all of this just a part of my effort to try to spread the area where these guys are situated and where they're fruiting. So if you've had any success seeding chanterelles in the forest near you, I'd love to hear about your story. This is one of those things, kind of unsure of whether or not this will bear any fruit in the coming season, but at the same time, really can't hurt. And, it just seems to put things in the right perspective out here. Just an attempt to try to give back a little bit to these mushrooms that we love so much. So I'll be interested to check back on this specific spot next year to see if it worked. And to be totally honest, the bag's getting a little full. But boy, it's hard to walk right by these guys when they're jumping out at you. Seems like this guy wants to come home with me. I've passed on some of his buddies, but this one was a looker. And the day just wouldn't be complete without saying hi to one of my favorites. This is the West Coast reishi, Ganoderma organense. And boy, you can see that these ones are really growing to a nice size. You can see too how they've spored out. So these are both growing on western hemlock, and that cocoa powder looking surface there up on the cap are the spores. If I scratch below, look at that. So that's where it gets its name, Ganoderma. Shiny skin, that's the varnished conch underneath. You can see that lacquer look or appearance. I'm going to leave these here, let them continue to spore out and do their thing, but boy, always a pleasure seeing this one. Here's another off in the distance. You can see the pileated woodpecker spending some time with the reishi. He knows what it's all about. Just hanging out. Boy, two of my favorites side by side. And as I was making my way to the edge of the forest, look what I encountered. You recognize this? This is what I presume will probably be the last fruiting, at least in my area here in the Pacific Northwest, of the prince. So this is Agaricus augustus, which some people regard as the tastiest mushroom out here. You can see this one's really fresh, so see how that partial veil fully intact underneath. This cap is going to have these golden kind of scales to them. This is, of course, in the Agaricus genus. Some of you may have caught the video that I put out months back, specifically on this one, on how to identify it and how to track it down and find it. If you haven't seen that, I'd recommend that you go check it out. This is one of the best mushrooms that you'll find out here. Here's another pair of these guys, and boy, you can see one of the really distinctive features of this. So aside from those golden scales up top, you can see those really clearly. You can see where it broke through the duff. Underneath though, look, you can see that really pronounced annulus or skirt. You also see shaggy stipe, and perhaps most distinctively, let me give this guy a tug. Wow, look at that skirt. So as this continues to age, it's going to reveal those dark spores, but above all else, this has a really pleasant almond aroma. So if you haven't found this one yet this year, get out. This weekend might be your last opportunity to track this down. So good luck out there, and until next time, happy trails.